Here, read this.
Woof.
Hello, good morning, and welcome to John Kay's bookshop in Edinburgh, where I have just got time before I open up to tell you about some books that I've been reading recently. First of all, we've got this, The Other McCoy by Brian McCabe, a short comic novel about an impressionist, a comedian impressionist, who is rumoured to have thrown himself off the Dean Bridge and died. In fact, he's alive and well. It might be some other McCoy who that has happened to, hence the title. I didn't enjoy this at all. I was completely disappointed by it. It sounded very promising from that synopsis, but it quickly turns into the story of an impressionist who isn't feeling himself, shall we say. Books like this always remind me of a quote that bugged me when I first heard it and has sort of lingered in my head like a sting ever since. It's a quote from Ian McEwan, who said that he'd fallen out with the idea of the comic novel. Reading a comic novel, he said, is like being held down and tickled. And that really wound me up, because what he's describing there is a bad comic novel. He could be describing a bad comedian. Any bad comedy is like being held down and tickled, compelled to laugh when you don't feel like it. But it's nothing at all like reading a good comic novelist. And the worst thing about this book is that it's trying to be funny throughout, and it's never once funny. There's a sense of it's not funny, but it might have sat in something funny's bathwater. You know, it's got something of the atmosphere of funny. You think there's a laugh just around the corner all the time, but it never comes. I was also disappointed that it's a 90s Edinburgh novel. I was hoping for at least some sense of Edinburgh 30 years ago. And it's really, I mean, you get St Giles, you get Dean Bridge, Leith is referred to. Nothing that a tourist couldn't have picked up in about half an hour. And just finally, before I move on to much better books, it also suffers from that sort of poverty picaresque thing. A kind of Irvine Welsh insinuation that being poor is just like such a lark. It's basically like drinking beer and hanging out with really colourful characters. Some of them might have hooks for hands. It's a blast. And I don't know, that just rings very, very 90s, but also very just sour, I would say. So, not a fan. I'm aware that Brian McCabe is a really big deal, and this is the first novel of his that I've read, and I will try some more. If you've read some and you think I'm way out of line, I'd love to hear why I'm wrong, but also your recommendations for what to try next. Moving on, this was an ebook, so I don't have a cover for you. Challenger by Adam Higginbotham. This is the story of the 1986 Challenger disaster, the space shuttle that exploded 73 seconds into its launch, killing 7 astronauts. One of whom, Krista McAuliffe, was a teacher who had been included in the mission as part of the Teacher in Space program. She was due to present 2 lessons live from space to school kids back on Earth. It's obviously a tragic story. It is grippingly told by Adam Higginbotham, and it's more than just a sort of just purely focused on the 1986 disaster. It goes all the way back and tells the story of NASA's tarnished idealism, starting from the gauntlet thrown down by JFK to get a man in the moon within 10 years, and seeing how that idealism got chipped away at and decayed by budget cuts, by people cutting corners, by people desperate to maintain their good PR. NASA got to the point where they were so well known for their delays and setbacks and gaffes that they had gone from being seen as everything that was great and idealistic about America to a bit of a joke. And even with the Challenger, they were being mocked by the media for having these delayed launch dates, and that also contributed to oversights, to rushing things, which obviously had fatal consequences in the case of the Challenger. I've got to say, I didn't realise quite how much of a scandal the Challenger disaster was. I knew that there was some kind of corner cutting and technical oversights. I guess having never read about it in as much depth as this book, I'd always assumed that was kind of countered by the technology being so new that there were things that they hadn't foreseen. actually reading this book is, and obviously if you watch a documentary on the Challenger or have looked into it in any great depth, you realise no, they foresaw exactly the problem that came up in this in the disastrous launch. It's really really quite terrible, angering to read, but also completely exhilarating. Higginbotham takes you from the lives of the astronauts who are preparing to go on the mission, to the engineers, to some of the people, you can't really call them whistleblowers, but the people who are calling out their bosses and saying, this is going to happen, this is really wrong, you need to do the difficult thing now and cancel this launch. It's only recently come out, I think it came out last year. I was inspired to read it by a book I talked about on the last iteration of this recent reads series. Nana Visitor's Star Trek book, Open a Channel, A Woman's Trek, which looked at how women have been presented and treated by Star Trek. And obviously, Nichelle Nichols is a huge part of that story. She played Uhura on the original series. And there is a section in Nana Visitor's book that is actually told again in Adam Higginbotham's, which has to do with NASA's PR drive to try and get women involved in the space program. Women had not been made welcome and had been it'd been laughed off, the idea of having female astronauts. When it came to thinking, you know what, it might be a good public relations move to have women on board, they had to really try and drum up some interest, and they reached out to celebrities, including Nichelle Nichols, who not only encouraged there to be people of color, black astronauts, but women as well. And it's little stories like that, of which there are many in the book, that really sharpen the tragedy. You know, there's a real idealism and a utopian feeling about traveling into space. I don't know, there are some activities where people put their lives at risk, which I find very difficult to understand. And going into space is not one of them. It's not like bungee jumping or skydiving or even sort of touching the void type mountaineering, which is somewhat more understandable. But going into space, one thing that also lends this book a real thrill is the descriptions of spacewalking, of surviving astronauts who describe the allure of space, which is easy to understand and impossible to imagine. One of the stories that really, really stands out, and I've forgotten the astronaut's name, it's someone who goes for a spacewalk, so goes up in a shuttle, leaves the shuttle, basically floats about in space and then comes back to the shuttle. And he's an astronaut, he's a military person, so his language is not colourful or anything, but the way he under-describes this moment actually sent chills down the back of my neck. He said when he came back to the shuttle after his spacewalk, that was the saddest moment of my life. And that seemed to encapsulate why these astronauts, they knew the risks, then they probably had some idea. They didn't certainly know about the flaw on the Challenger, but they had some idea there was a history of things going wrong and of things being overlooked. They knew what they were getting into, and they were very, very intelligent. But I can totally understand why they'd still take the risk. You glimpse the reasons in little lines like that. Terrific book. I'd strongly recommend it if you want to know more about history of NASA, history of space travel, and the disaster itself. Moving on, the second half of this video is going to just deal with Robert Louis Stevenson. So I've got a spate of Robert Louis Stevenson podcasts coming out. One of them will be with Carla Manfredi, who wrote this book, Robert Louis Stevenson's Pacific Impressions. This is a book that draws from 4 family albums that the Stevensons took when they were in the South Seas. So these are photographs, and what I hadn't really appreciated fully is how photography was just booming at the time that Stevenson was in the South Seas. And it had actually become portable. It had become, for the first time, it's a bit like, you know, the auteur boom in Hollywood in the 60s, where suddenly everyone can afford to hold a movie camera. And you might have seen photos of Stevenson in Samoa or Vailima, his house in Samoa, where he's sort of sitting on the veranda and he's surrounded by the household. Well, Carla talks about photographs like that and talks about some of the figures in those photos, but she's also talking about much more candid photographs, which I haven't seen a lot of. Most of them are unpublished, They're actually kept here in Edinburgh in it's either the Writers' Museum or the City Art Museum. And they are surprisingly modern looking. There's selfies in there of a kind. They're very candid family shots. And there's also shots of the people they met, the South Sea Islanders. And what Carla's book is absolutely fascinating at describing is the interface between photography and these South Sea Islanders, who have a sense of their reputation with white colonialists. The islands in the South Seas at this point are being carved up by 4 colonial powers, French, German, English, and Americans. And at this point, the islanders have got used to the sort of stories that are being told about them by white people. Their rumoured cannibalism, for example, which probably has some truth in it, but as Carla explains, the truth is a little bit more nuanced, quite a lot more nuanced than is being reported. I'll let Carla explain it much better in the podcast, but just briefly, things like ritual sacrifice and certain death rites are conflated with sort of wholesale cannibalism, of which there was probably some, but probably not as much as the white colonialists became obsessed by and started telling stories about. So one of the fascinating things about Carla's book is it tells the story of how the South Sea Islanders used their knowledge of what white people thought of them to improve their own circumstances, to perhaps send up some aspects of their supposed cannibalism, to create shock, and to also reclaim a little bit of their own island identity that had been herded out by the French colonialists and the English and Americans and so forth. So yes, look out for that podcast. It'll be on The Feast of Famine will be the first part, which is a South Sea ballad that Stevenson wrote. And then there will be a second part, which is just with Carla talking about this book and Stevenson in the South Seas in general. And I fully recommend her book, which also reproduces a lot of those photographs, so you can get to see those as well. Okay, moving on, and sticking with Stevenson, this book is Treasure Island Tramp by Jeremy Hodges. This is also subject of an upcoming podcast. Long-time listeners, if there are such things, will remember Jeremy Hodges was my guest for my episode on The Black Arrow by Stevenson, way back. It was quite an early episode. And I've interviewed him again just recently about Treasure Island Tramp, which is his book, a biography of someone called Robert Stevenson. Now, this isn't Jeremy's first book on Stevenson. He's written a book about Stevenson's time in Paris, and he's also written a book about Stevenson's relationship with his cousin, Catherine de Matos, dedicatee of Jekyll and Hyde. We talked about that on the last episode, so if you want to hear more about that book, check out that podcast. I don't even know when that came out, maybe sort of 2021-ish. But this book, Treasure Island Tramp, as yet unpublished, is the story of one Robert Stevenson, a man born in Aberdeen in 1879, who claimed to be the son of Robert Louis Stevenson. And eventually, Robert Stevenson became quite well known. He became sort of notorious as this guy going around claiming to be the son of Robert Louis Stevenson. Jeremy has basically written his biography, and there's surprisingly quite a lot to go at. There's a lot of data on him for someone who was frequently homeless, because he was throughout his life he was often interviewed. He left records of his life story published in the press. He was an artist, so he made drawings, and he travelled a lot. And he had this uncanny ability, which Jeremy describes, of unveiling himself within Stevenson groups. So he became quite well known across the world. One of the really interesting parts of the story is just how often Robert seems to be in the footsteps of his alleged father. He travels to America. He travels to Paris. So he visits these sites of Stevenson's own life, who is by now dead. By the time Robert's an adult, he's dead, obviously. But he meets people that RLS met, and frequently. One of the refrains throughout the book is how often people say, "My God, you're his double. You are an absolute spit of Robert Louis Stevenson." It's an absolutely fascinating story, and Jeremy tells it really, really well. It's a scandal that this book hasn't found a publisher yet, and I hope a publisher comes to their senses soon. and gets it out. So I'd really appreciate it if you listen to the episode on the Treasure Island Tramp when it comes out, and spread it around if you enjoy it, because it'll be great to get this book a bit of attention. And then the last book I'm going to talk about, just quickly, because it's directly connected to Jeremy's, is No Son of Mine by G.B. Stern. This is a novel that came out in 1948. And in words that may sound a little familiar, it's the story of one Robert Stevenson, a man who claims to be the son of Robert Louis Stevenson. The extraordinary thing about this novel, which I'd read before I heard that Jeremy had written a book about the real Robert Stevenson, the extraordinary thing about this book is that it's a novel, and G.B. Stern started writing it, I think, based on hearsay that there was someone claiming to be the son of Robert Louis Stevenson, but without knowing much more about the details. And when Jeremy comes to discuss the book, he says that you couldn't have done a better job at trying to fictionalize someone out of existence. G.B. Stern's story is close enough to Robert's life to resemble him. For people who knew about Robert Stevenson's claim of being Robert Louis Stevenson's son, to see him as the character called Robert Stevenson. But it was also different enough to completely damn him. The character in the novel is a dissembler. He practices being Robert Louis Stevenson's son. He reads up on RLS and reads private correspondence to try and pick up on details and make his story more convincing. Totally unlike the real Robert Stevenson, who doesn't really appear to have ever read his alleged father. And so what's extraordinary about this story is how close it gets to the story of Robert Stevenson, despite the fact that when G.B. Stern started writing it, she was really basing it on hearsay, and she hadn't heard about the real Robert. But she somehow gave him the same name, gave him almost the same birth year. I think she's a year off, and also had various aspects of his life match up as well. So really, really interesting. I mean, tantalizing to someone who's into Stevenson and the idea of fictional doubles and that kind of thing. And I thought I'd just, having brought this totally nondescript blue cover out to show you, I thought I'd just read you a little bit. This is from Stern's preface, which gives you a sense of her sort of foxy hold on fiction and reality. She's talking about the ethics of fictionalized biography. This is a novel, I should say. It does make several segues into what you would call literary criticism. It's written very much like a biography. People don't usually pay that compliment that way around. I would say of Jeremy's book, it's a biography, it's research, it's very, very solid journalism, and it's really excitingly told, like a novel. This book is a novel which presents as biography in a way. Anyway, this is from her preface. Otherwise, there has been no violation of honesty, for Robert, as I said before, is wholly imagined except in his origin, which by conjecture could be strangely linked with biography. As if green water meadows on one side of a stream and a classical garden, formal and restrained, on the other, were linked by one of those little humped bridges that one sees frequently in soft, old landscape prints, running up steeply from each side to a high centre to divide as well as join. That, to me, sounds like world-class equivocation, trying to have your cake and eat it. But anyway, it's a well-told novel. G.B. Stern, incidentally, was a very, very popular novelist. This is one of the reasons her book was so damaging to Robert's case. As soon as this book came out, people assumed that she was basing it wholesale on his life, and that really, put him out of business as someone claiming to be Robert Louis Stevenson's son. You'll notice I'm avoiding the question of whether or not Jeremy or myself, for that matter, think that Robert Stevenson was Robert Louis Stevenson's son. I feel I should leave that to Jeremy. So please do tune in for that one. That will be, the title will be something like Treasure Island Tramp. And now it's time to open the shop. So I hope you have a lovely week and see you next time.